Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Human Tell podcast. I am your host, Lolita Morrow. Since this is live, I want to make sure my mic is on, and it is. I'm Vice President of Brand Partnerships at My Code Media. And I just want to say that if you have ever wondered what makes women's sports so amazingly unique, or how individuals decode information in advertising, or even how today's economic and political uncertainty is impacting travel decisions, then this podcast series is for you. Now, for today's topic, we are going to discuss what we've learned about why people are cutting back on alcohol. My guests today are Jordan Cusner, a member of the Human Tell community and the Senior Director of Consumer Insights at Inspire Brands, where he oversees research for Buffalo Wild Wings, Dunkin', Sonic, and several other well-known QSR brands that keep my teenagers fed on weekends. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you. Great to be here, Lolita. And we're open during the week as well, so your teenagers can come anytime.
We try to cook during the week sometimes, but the weekends are the big treat. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe we should have brought a mocktail or something.
I like that.
Yeah, I have morning old coffee, so that'll work for me. Jordan and I are joined by Ruby Warrington, author of the book Sober Curious and host of the million download podcast by the same name. Ruby has spearheaded the movement for us to rethink our relationship with alcohol and is an active partner with a myriad of businesses, universities, and organizations. Ruby, welcome to the Human Tell podcast. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to get into this. There's so much to discuss today. So I'm really curious about where this conversation is going to go.
I love it. I'm excited as well. And now, before we begin, there's something I have to tell you both. One, I am a former bartender. Two, about 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Think Like a Bartender, which talks about the intersection of the business industry and the hospitality industry. And three, I have been known to occasionally love one or three old fashions here or there. So that doesn't mean I'm going to sway one direction or the other in the conversation, but I thought I just should let you guys know that in the beginning.
It's good
You're
background.
you're here to support me, Lolita, I think.
Okay, love it, love it. Now, walking into this conversation, it's really important that we share the why and the how. So first off, why are we exploring this? And how did we explore this? Now, the why is pretty simple. When traditional alcohol categories began declining last year in 2024, and then we saw non-alcoholic beer, wine, and spirit sales reach $1 billion, there was definitely a case, pun intended, to dig deeper into why this was happening. Now, according to the Human Tell April 2025 survey on alcohol, cannabis-infused, and caffeinated beverages, the percentage of people over 21 who in the last 12 months or in the next 12 months intended to decrease their alcohol consumption was at 30%. So knowing this, what was Human Tell's goal? Our goal was to understand what motivates people who are actively trying to cut back on alcohol consumption. So what we did was we explored the emotions, the values, and the attitudes that influence people to drink less. So now that we've set the table, or maybe placed the napkin at the bar, I'd like for us to sort of start this conversation with a discussion on why each of our guests thought this topic was important to join us and how it's relevant to them personally or professionally. If you don't mind, Jordan, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Thank you. Great intro, Lolita. Really excited to be here. Well, I think there's two angles for me. One is personal. I alluded to the fact that I'm known to imbibe now and again, and I've seen lately more and more coverage, first about Ruby's book, certainly, which I know we'll get to, but even in traditional media talking about these various trends. And obviously, I've had the chance to go through the Human Tell data that we're going to be discussing today. So on a personal level, I feel like I've been exposed to a lot of these themes a ton. And then professionally, obviously this impacts our businesses, but really it's more about, and our discussion today especially, is just about consumer behavior generally. And it's very, very common that we see these personal trends, private trends kind of bubbling over and changing things broadly, both in the restaurant space or QSR generally, or in terms of how people shop or how they entertain themselves. And so trying to get ahead of and understand consumer behavior, where they're headed, what makes them, or what motivates consumers, and trying to understand the kernel of what really is driving those new behaviors, and thinking about how we can better understand and connect with those trends.
Fantastic. So as a person who actually consumes and cares about what the consumer journey is as it relates to alcohol consumption, I think that definitely has you very invested in the content today.
Absolutely.
Right. Ruby, what about you?
So I coined the term sober curious coming up on 10 years ago now. It was the beginning of 2026 the beginning of 2016, sorry, that I started speaking publicly about being sober curious. And this came out of my own kind of involving relationship with alcohol. I'd always been what I would have thought of as a normal social drinker, meaning I had never experienced any devastating kind of life dramas or crises connected to my drinking. I drank the same as, if not less than, most of the people that I did my drinking with, but I definitely enjoyed a drink, and it was a big part of my social life, my work life, my family life. It was at the center of my life, really, as it is for so many of us, right? But I was also increasingly aware that some of the kind of smaller issues, just general kind of mental health issues, anxiety, general physical well-being, were very connected to my common and garden, normal social drinking habits, right? But when I started to look into what would it look like to investigate this, maybe cut back or even remove alcohol, all roads led directly to, you have a drinking problem, you're an alcoholic, you must be in AA. There was a very, very kind of binary approach to cutting back or even quitting drinking. And it just seemed to me that I couldn't be the only one, the only normal drinker who was having some problems or would like to maybe drink less, or was just curious about their relationship to alcohol, but also to the wider drinking culture. And so I started hosting a live event series in New York to discuss this subject, right? And I needed to come up with a term for who this event was for. And that's where Sober Curious came into being. It was for people who were curious about what a sober lifestyle might look like and why it was so taboo to talk about this outside of recovery circles. And so that event series, 80 people turned up at the first event. By the time I hosted the last one that I hosted 2 years later, 250 people turned up. So clearly I was definitely not the only one who was wanting to at least have a conversation about this. Those events spawned my first book, which came out at the end of 2018. That was followed with the Sober Curious Reset in 2020, which guides you through 100 days alcohol-free. And really what I think I have done, again, born very much from my own need for this, was to give language to an experience that so many people share that was previously just kind of buried in the wider conversation about addiction and recovery. And I think the fact that this term is now, the latest research shows that this term is familiar to 1 in 4 Americans. And as our research we're discussing today shows, a hell of a lot of people are sober curious, right?
Yes.
I think that the fact that that term has become so ubiquitous shows us what a huge consumer demand is just sort of waiting to be met by these new products that are coming onto the market in terms of the alcohol-free beverage category that has just exploded in even the past 5 years, you know?
Yeah. That was actually a perfect segue, and thank you for sharing that, because the next question I was going to ask, and even pose the question to myself, is where are we personally sort of with our relationship with alcohol? Ruby, you just let us know sort of what was the precipice of you starting to look into being sober curious and have this conversation, and even coin the phrase to go from like 18 to 250 people. For me, I have always been, a social drinker. Gen X, sort of a part of the work culture. There's, happy hours after work. I worked for spirits brands before, then being a bartender. And I always had a good handle on my relationship with alcohol. Now, this is what I'm saying. But I did notice during COVID, it was a little slippery slope for me because I became my best friend. I was my own personal bartender. and I enjoyed my tips. So let's say my pour was maybe a half an ounce more, and the quantity really started to grow versus the quality. And then coming out of COVID, I realized when I'd go to a bar, I'm like, hey, this is kind of light. And I was like, well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's you. So I had to almost do a reset. Like, why do I want to have this drink? Is it a reason for celebrating? Am I just simply thirsty? Am I leaning in because other people around me are drinking? And being able to assess that, I can easily say now I make conscious decisions on when I want to have, a spirit or cocktail or even a mocktail, just depending on what's going on in my life. So that's really what changed my relationship with alcohol, was really during COVID. Jordan, do you have anything to share about your relationship?
Sure. This is a guilt-free zone, I hope, guys.
Judgment free.
Judgment free. The whole sober curious approach is there's no right and wrong, only what's right for you.
Love it. Well, so I try to be mindful and choiceful about the alcohol that I do consume. For me, during COVID, I kind of became a little bit of an amateur bartender as a way to entertain my friends, and I'm fairly serious about that. And in fact, it's kind of reduced a little bit of my alcohol consumption in that I don't drink hard alcohol during the week. When I go out to restaurants, I do occasionally order a cocktail as to celebrate or really to enhance the experience. I really feel like it adds another dimension to that social setting. But because I've become such a cocktail snob, I tend not to order cocktails when I go out. Maybe it's because the pour is not as heavy as yours and mine might be, Lolita. And so I order, wine or beer generally when I'm going out. But even then, I try to be a little bit mindful about when and how I consume. And it's meant to be something that's similar to the way you describe, happy hours, corporate events, social things, when it enhances the evening. When I go out by myself, I very rarely drink alone.
Yeah. And I think what we saw through all three of our examples is everyone sort of has a journey into their consumption and a rationale to how much they consume or the type of spirit or libation in which they do consume. So thank you guys for sharing that. But with that, let's go ahead and jump directly into the insights. So the main question of the research was quite simple. The main question was, how important are each of the subject matters in your own decision to drink less alcohol? And there were a number of subject matters presented. Now, the physical and emotional component, of course, which we'll speak about, sort of rose to the top. But also there was the social and the practical motivators. Those had some strong indicators as well. So let's start with physical motivators. So Jordan, let's talk about the way people feel alcohol impacts their bodies. And that could be for a number of different reasons on how strong that is. That could be based on your age, how much you consume, hereditary concerns. But what are some of the things that you've learned and that the research shows that we've learned about the physical motivators for cutting back on alcohol?
Yeah, well, taking it even a step back, if I could, Lolita, listening
Sure.
to Ruby's setup, I think it's very, very interesting and maybe a sign of the times that historically it's been a very agenda, idealistically driven conversation around being sober, holistically. AA was the organization you referenced, and there's a lot of positivity in that community. I think the physical conversation that you're bringing up now is more of an intrinsic, I want to improve myself exercise, which maybe didn't exactly align with some of these broader ideals around being sober more generally. And I think what was so interesting about the research was how many people had their own reasons for becoming sober or exploring sobriety or exploring being sober on some level or managing their intake. Wasn't surprised to see physical reasons or as underpinning that discussion. What was interesting is how varied those reasons were. And to me, that was very eye-opening. And I think it really speaks precisely to what Ruby was describing moments ago, that people were coming to this movement for all different reasons. And they were all rooted in their own personal choice or their own personal goals. And back to, so maybe I'll pause there. I don't want to steal Ruby's thunder, but I do think the physical piece is not surprising at all. I think that's maybe the first thing people get to. I think, Ruby, you mentioned earlier mental health, and I know we'll get to that later. That's probably something that takes a little bit more introspection, a little bit more honesty about oneself versus you wake up, you're hungover, you're feeling kind of crappy in the morning after a long night drinking, you want to exercise or you want to go out and do something more active and you don't feel like you're well enough to do that. That feels like the first and most obvious place where you're going to feel the burden of previous night's drinking.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, waking up, I mean, a hangover is the first. In fact, I came across some research while I was working. In fact, this came out after I had finished the manuscript for the first book, but I can't remember where the research came from. I apologize. But the experts had identified 5 levels of problem drinking. Level 5 was, you're endangering your life with your drinking habits and you need to be in a rehab facility and you need to, this is a, very serious like life and death issue. Level 1 is hangovers, right? Hangovers are a problem associated with our drinking. And I think most people who have consumed alcohol can relate to probably even having an experience of a hangover so bad that you vowed that you are never going to drink again. Why do I keep doing this to myself? And I hear that again and again and again from people who are coming into the Sober Curious movement, to the retreats that I host, to the Facebook group that I manage. This is a common lament. But what I've uncovered, or what I've seen time and time again, is that if the physical well-being kind of aspect is what typically draws people in, very much linked as well to issues with sleep. Alcohol has a huge impact on our sleep. I think there's something like over 70% of people perceive alcohol as being a sleep aid. It's something that helps them go to sleep. But I think many people as well have had the experience that once the initial kind of sedative effects wear off, we can often kind of wake up in the middle of the night, mind whirring, in a sweat, all the anxieties that we've been drinking to forget right there in our front of mind. So sleep being then obviously lack of sleep having a huge impact on our physical well-being overall. So these are often the kind of like entry points. And then people start to remove or cut back, start feeling better physically. And often that's when they start to notice the mental health benefits of not drinking, and also possibly the mental health issues that they were drinking to cover up or suppress.
Right. I think about when I was younger and those physical motivators, it wasn't that strong. At a certain age, a group of friends, we would go out for maybe Martini Monday or Cocktail Tuesday. And maybe 9, 10 o'clock, we get home and we wake up in the morning, we pop up, everyone was at work at 8 o'clock. It was fantastic. And then slowly, Ruby, like I'm having a hangover, or I'm feeling a little sluggish, or I'm having a little bit of the brain fog. And a lot of that was really overconsumption at the time, and also not taking care of myself. So I do think some of the physical motivators are sort of top of mind, because you want to look good and you want to feel good. And I think right now, when we talk about what are those physical motivators, we talk about vitality. We talked about health. We talked about nutrition. And I'll admit, I've tried to do all the tricks. Someone said, eat a banana before you go to bed after a night of drinking, or, heavy on the B6 or B12, or drink a glass of water in between cocktails. And while all of those things seem to have worked, there's nothing like being able to consciously decide when to stop and how much to have, to your point, Ruby.
The only cure for a hangover is not to drink in the first place, truly, because a hangover is not actually caused by alcohol. It's caused by the chemicals that are produced in the liver when it breaks down the alcohol. So there's no amount of alcohol. There's no amount of preemptive kind of methods that you can take that are going to prevent a hangover if you then go ahead and drink alcohol, unfortunately.
There are hundreds of myths and recipes out there that people have tried. And to your point, I mean, that's probably the best way to prevent a hangover. Yeah.
Lolita, I think I'm having a little bit of a breakthrough here, and Ruby as well. I would never label myself sober curious.
Okay.
So, or sober, honest confession. But I am I'm an athlete. I play, hockey, and I'm a cyclist. We have a playoff game tonight. Beer is a large part of our rec league. We call it beer league. There are guys who, myself included, often have a beer on the sideline on the bench. But when I have a big game coming up, like the playoffs tonight, I definitely make a choice for the days leading into that I am not going to drink. I never would have said that this was a step into sobriety, or that I was sober curious, but it's a recognition of the impact that alcohol has on my system. And if I know I have something physically demanding coming up, something that matters to me, I'm sure this is true of, family events or a wedding or, my daughter's bat mitzvah, I want to be sharp.
Right.
And so I often make that choice, explicitly, and I tell people I'm not drinking this weekend. I've got a triathlon or something. I've never thought of that as being sober curious, and it's clearly indicative that, or of this trend that you're describing around physicality and the physical impacts. And I think it's rather kind of eye-opening for me to consider that I'm kind of already in this space a little bit.
Well,
Yeah.
what I thought was really interesting about the research too was how many people in the youngest categories were citing physical well-being or physical health as one of their motivators. Because, like you mentioned, Lolita, I mean, just as we get older, our body is less able to process alcohol. We have more responsibilities on our plate. We're just tireder in general, right?
We
This is
are.
a fact of aging. Um, we notice those physical effects more, but I thought it was very interesting that the younger generations, the younger subset of the survey, were also very aware of the physical impacts of drinking. And I mean, I was shocked to discover in my research for the book that alcohol is the third leading cause of preventable deaths in the United States. After cigarettes, after obesity, we have alcohol. That's due to its links to things like heart disease, various cancers, high blood pressure, et cetera, right? And so in my groups and workshops, it's typically the 50 plus group
Mhm.
who are coming saying that they're coming for health reasons because they're starting to notice some of the actual physical impacts and they're wanting to safeguard their health into their old age. But I thought the interesting thing that this survey shone a light on was the fact that younger generations are actually thinking, not necessarily in preventative terms at that life stage, but their actions will be preventing their risk of developing multiple chronic diseases in later life, which is such a huge burden on us as individuals and the healthcare system in general.
Yeah. And that's a great point. The younger generations do care about vitality and sort of the circles in which they have conversations, the people around them. And I've even started to notice now I'm part of, giving it away here, maybe Generation X, where, we were sort of introduced earlier on to consuming alcohol, again, be it either because of a work event or family members. But now I'm starting to notice as my friends are starting to have children and people are focused more on their health, things have gone from, hey, let's get maybe a hard cocktail to maybe we'll have one at the end, maybe start with maybe a glass of wine. There's just a lot more options where it was normally just a top of mind reaction to just automatically have a drink.
And there are more options for socializing too, or younger people have more varied interests. I think for Gen X, I'm proud card carrying Gen Xer too. Nightclubs and bars and concerts were kind of what you did to socialize. And I think younger people now might equally just as likely go to a yoga class to socialize or go to do a 5K as a social event. That wasn't something that our generation was particularly interested in, I don't think.
True, very true. And sort of as we sort of move from the physical motivators to the emotional motivators, we sort of talked a little bit about that. But in general, most people want overall emotional well-being. They want to make sure that they are reducing stress and anxiety and anything that adds to that. They want to be conscious of that. So in addition to, we talked about mental clarity, not having sort of that brain fog, and even enhancing personal safety and decision making. These are some key emotional motivators as well. And it doesn't have to be a horrible experience that a person has had. It's quite simply, you can't quite remember some of the things that you were talking about, or maybe after a night of drinking, you knew it was an important thing that you needed to do and you can't think of it. So emotionally, that weighs on your clarity. It weighs on even personal safety, crossing the street, God forbid, getting behind the wheel of a car, and just general decision making. And I think now we're starting to see all of these different indicators and how important they are. Jordan, what are your thoughts on sort of those emotional motivators?
Yeah, again, no judgment of anyone else. When Ruby was describing the 5 stages or steps of impact on someone's body from alcohol, physicality or headaches being the first, this is the first category where when I read the data, it felt like, oh, this is a drinking problem. And even the way you described it, and I don't know if that's really fair to say, especially because I don't necessarily suffer from those things. So it's easy for me to kind of say, oh, the physical is not really part of the equation. But I think this is maybe the traditional category that everybody was able to kind of quickly identify as it's impacting your life in a negative way. It's you lack clarity in the way you consider things, your own safety or the safety of those around you. I think it's a very, very important part of this equation. Certainly, it's great to see that there are certain cohorts for whom that is their number one priority. And I think Lolita, you mentioned how the younger generation is really focused on vitality. I think everybody is focused on vitality, but everything becomes a trade-off. And I think, unfortunately, Gen X, millennials, we didn't have some of this permission just to talk about it in this way, and we didn't have the language, Ruby, about being sober curious. It was all or nothing, and I think we are all highly medicated as a people in the U.S. and certainly around the world for a lot of the things that you're kind of calling out on those slides in terms of mental health. Now that we are now seeing alcohol consumption as maybe being a part of that, or excessive alcohol consumption as playing a role there, I think we're giving people the vocabulary to reflect and find their own solutions and ensure that they're kind of leading the life they want to be leading.
Yeah. Some of those key emotional motivators almost bridge or parallel with the social motivators, right? Those were sort of under the subtopics of identity and relationships. And those are some of the things we were talking about. One was aligning your life choices with your personal values. If you want to be more healthy, if you're going to yoga class or working out multiple times a week, does it help you to overconsume or consume something that may sort of drag you down? And then if we look under, relationships, just being more present. And in some cases with heavy alcohol consumption, being more trustworthy, and that can affect sort of close relationships. One of my examples, my social circle at one time was a circle of individuals who were highly intelligent, highly educated. They still are. But when we were younger, that's where we met. It was our cheers. That is, we downloaded about the day, and we felt good when we left. And it wasn't really about the consumption. It was about the circle and those individuals socially helping you. Again, as we got older, it was a little bit of that trade-off, right? That opportunity cost. What are you going to give up to get something? I want to see my friends. I want to be in that circle, but maybe we'll have a coffee instead, or maybe we go to this really cool Moroccan tea spot. So I think we started to just expand through our social circles, and it made those motivators, it gave us more choices, and it allowed us to be more present in the moment. Ruby, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the social motivators, especially when you first started about the sober curious movement. Did you find a lot of people were worried that their social circles or those motivators would change if they sort of stepped back and became sober?
Yeah, this is absolutely one of people's number one concerns, given that alcohol for the majority of drinkers is a social lubricant, and it's so embedded and interwoven into all of our social lives to the extent that let's get a drink is kind of like the default phrase for like, let's meet up and be social, regardless of who we're speaking to or what context, right? I think that, I call it FOMA, fear of missing alcohol. And it's definitely one of the ones that really, really plagues people. Just this fear that I'm going to stop getting invited to things. People are going to think I'm boring. I'm going to miss out on stuff if I don't drink. I'm not going to be included. I'm not going to fit in. I'm not going to feel like one of the gang. The need to belong is like one of our most deep-rooted human emotional needs. And so fitting in is a big motivator for drinking a lot of the time, especially if you consider the age that most of us are introduced to alcohol. It's often way before age 21. It's in our teens when fitting in and being accepted and being cool is so, so, so important, And so those really deeply embedded social fears are a big kind of barrier to people getting sober curious, actually.
And I think that's also one of the reasons maybe why mocktails have become so popular. When I go to certain conferences or even just check out a menu at a bar, there's a new dedicated section where it looks like a cocktail. It may feel like you have a cocktail, so you don't have that FOMA, right? That fear of missing alcohol, because you are sitting there, you can cheers with something, but it just doesn't have some of the negative side effects.
Yeah. And I think this is, some people have likened this to the advent of kind of plant-based food, having a bigger and bigger presence on menus to kind of meet consumer demand, right? It used to be that maybe if you wanted a vegetarian or a vegan dish, God forbid, you would have to, there might be a separate menu. Then maybe it would kind of like be maybe one dish in each course would have like a vegetarian option. And now there are obviously entire plant-based restaurants which are thriving to serve that community. So I think we're seeing a similar thing with kind of non-alcoholic and spirit-free options for beverages. And what a lot of people discover is that where they had felt like their enjoyment of social settings came from the alcohol, it actually comes from just, it feels really good to connect and be social with other human beings. And having a drink in your hand that doesn't stand out as something kind of unusual, that is as delicious or as special as what everybody else is drinking, often that has a kind of a placebo effect. And it can be enough to just kind of wipe away those initial fears about not fitting in or feeling like you can't partake or participate rather. So I think that's one of the reasons why that category has expanded so rapidly.
That's true. I was listening while you were speaking, and I thought about you, Jordan. I thought about even in the corporate setting, it's not shunned as much as, let's say, cigarettes. There was a time decades ago where if 10 people wanted to step outside and have a cigarette, it was fine and it was like acceptable. And now even I have, friends that may quietly step away or go to the bathroom. They don't announce it because it's not that social sort of motivator anymore. You don't have that crew of people to do that. But it seems with alcohol, even in the mocktail version, there's still a space for that social interaction where it's not as frowned upon, even though there's a lot of data that talks to some of the negative effects of over-consuming.
Yeah, and one of the dimensions, maybe Ruby, that you hinted at but maybe didn't explicitly call out is the notion that if I stop drinking and go to one of these events, I'm going to be a buzzkill. People in the other, they will see me as detracting from their experience. So this mocktail enables me to fit in. No one even has to know that I'm not drinking. And some of the fear that somebody in that position might have of ruining everyone else's experience, which really is probably a fantasy, and it really, there's no impact at all. But now there's a complete alternative. The flip side, though, and Lolita, you kind of alluded to the corporate setting. I often wonder why I can't drink a no ABV beer in the office. I think I certainly can, right? I just think it would be incredibly weird and frowned upon, and I'm not sure why. I think it would. I worry about what it would. You talk about the flip side of being the buzzkill, drinking a soda instead of having a beer like everyone else. Now I've got the mocktail. Why can't I have essentially a carbonated beer flavored beverage in the office or right now on this live stream? I think there's still a certain stigma associated with that behavior, even if it is completely alcohol free.
Well, I think it's a testament really to how kind of good of a stand-in, like from a social perspective, these products are. It really does seem like you're having a beer, and like it's just, you wouldn't have a beer. Although Heineken Zero, when they were launching in the UK, part of their billboard campaign was someone kind of having a beer on their desk, like next to their laptop, like just during the workday,
Yeah.
And speaking to the corporate piece, I've actually heard multiple people talk about this almost as an HR issue in their workplace, feeling like as a non-drinker, if they weren't catered for at a work mixer or a work social event, they felt very excluded and like they weren't welcome. If everybody else was catered for with beer and wine, for example, and their option was water, they really felt like they weren't as welcome, and so had brought it to the HR department, sort of saying, can we make these experiences more inclusive for non-drinkers? Which I think is already another interesting development.
Yeah, that's true. I was just thinking about one of the last sort of in-office happy hours, maybe like pre-COVID, when we had that. And if there was someone not drinking, you made an assumption like maybe you're expanding your family, or you question, hey, is everything okay? And I think because we immediately went to the negative, that's how comfortable we were with our social circles and everyone, consuming the
and
alcohol.
the idea that the only people who would quit have had a serious problem with alcohol, and that's
Exactly.
there's something about their character, which it doesn't at all. Like any of us are susceptible to becoming more dependent on alcohol than we would like or than is good for us. Like it is ultimately a highly addictive substance that none of us are impervious to. That drinking habit, that regular drinking habit, hits at the same time, or as a devastating loss of a partner or loss of a job or some really hard life event, it can very quickly become way more problematic. So it's no slur on anyone's character if they have not been able to maintain a neutral relationship to alcohol. If anything, in my books, I talk about the fact that possibly all of us are a little bit addicted, and that there's nothing shameful about that. It's just the nature of the beast.
That's true. That's true. I think this sort of goes into one of the final data points that we uncovered, which was sort of the practical motivations. And I mean, nothing is more practical than work and money. And, we would think about the practical reasonings for decreasing consumption. Definitely productivity. We've talked about energy during the workday, that sort of rose to the top. And then anything that we indulge in, we typically have to pay for. So you think about saving money by not spending, that's definitely key. And in turn, that sort of helps with a lot of the long-term savings goals and sort of financial priorities. You know, Ruby, I'll pass this to you, but I'm wondering even if we can call out from a practicality perspective, even the tariffs,
Mm.
it would be nice that, we could still go out and enjoy cocktails, but if the prices are rising, there's the fact that 40% of the people actually anticipate shifting more alcohol consumption to home or drinking less just as a result of what could be an increase in paying for that beverage.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting. As somebody who no longer buys alcohol myself, I haven't noticed the hike. But one thing I did notice was when I started stepping back from drinking, how instantly every restaurant bill was halved, which is actually huge, even before the cost of living crisis that we've all been experiencing. One thing people do sometimes complain about is the fact that alcohol-free alternatives can cost the same as alcoholic beverages, even though they actually sometimes cost more to produce because they're often small batch produced. They're often using more complex ingredients. Alcohol, particularly an alcohol like vodka, is incredibly cheap to produce. But we perceive alcoholic products as having a higher value because they have an actual physical effect that we perceive as desirable. We're paying for the buzz more so than the product itself. But yeah, I do wonder if this will become something that people are taking into consideration, given the cost, especially of drinking in restaurants with the tariffs. Like I said, I haven't had direct experience of how that's increased prices yet.
Before you jump in, Jordan, I'd say, for me, even in my household, I'm the only person that drinks. My wife really doesn't drink. She might have a glass of wine and that's it. So the cost doesn't really hit us as much. But then again, going back to those social circles, when I find myself out, then that's where I start to really look at the price and think, well, wait, I don't recall, did this go up like $2 or $3? And even that is an additive motivator for me because I am trying to save money and I have long-term savings goals as well. But I do enjoy going out to a restaurant when I have my meal, looking at the menu and then selecting something that is sort of complementary to what I'm eating or how I'm feeling at the moment.
And it certainly might have an impact on you having 2 drinks instead of 3, for example.
Yeah. And it's interesting to that point, Ruby, you talk about reducing 2 drinks instead of 3, or as the data indicated, moving consumption from out of home to in home. I don't think, in my mind, any of those people would be sober. They're still drinking the alcohol. They're drinking it a little bit less. They're changing the locale of where they consume that alcohol. And yet I think it's part of this conversation. I think Sober Curious and the way that you think about that movement, it's provided a way for people to kind of dip a toe in the water. I also made the connection to plant-based meats when I read through this data. I think for a while, and I think it was inaccessible. It was hard to get. It's very expensive. You had to make all of your own food or what have you. Now you talked about having items like that on the menu. The other thought that I had was how the initial movement around plant-based was very much in terms of the impact on the world, and we're trying to make the world a better place and thinking about sustainability, et cetera. And that was a really tough pill for people to swallow. People liked having their meat. They wanted to go out and continue. I think slowly the movement and what I've heard from and some sources or some areas in this discussion was, what is a reasonable way that we can actually try to be more mindful about our consumption? And I heard someone talk about just having one meal a month that was plant-based. That became a very attainable goal for my family. We already kind of did meatless Mondays, or used fake taco meat on Taco Tuesday, and then we did it in a more of a mindful way. And I think similar to what you're talking about here in terms of the alcohol consumption, there's now a way to kind of explore sobriety or the impact, and whether it's reducing your alcohol consumption in the restaurant from 3 to 2, buying the alcohol, making it for yourself at home, and controlling your intake that way, or cutting your check in half like you described. I think those are all kind of more palatable ways for someone to kind of explore and try these different lifestyles.
Absolutely. And for some people, they find that they enjoy the benefits of not drinking so much that they're motivated to continue and maybe even cut out alcohol altogether, when that might not have been that was never my goal. It was never my goal to quit completely. I just wanted to stop feeling so bad when I drank. And slowly, over a period, honestly, of like over 10 years, I whittled my consumption down to nothing. It was, I think, over this whole period, I think it's like coming up on, it's just over 2 years since I actually had my last drink. And I still am I'm still not sober. Like, I'm still saying never. I've just, the number of occasions on which alcohol has felt like an appropriate substance, something I crave, desire, have reduced to none, basically.
I was about to put you on the spot and ask if you would consider yourself sober. I have a friend who similarly, for health reasons, I think took a month off and now has decided, I like the way I am without drinking. They would never say they are sober. They do say, I don't drink. And like you said, never say never. Maybe once in a while, this person I'm thinking about has not had a drink in years, but doesn't consider themselves to be sober and committed to that in any way beyond, it's just not something I like. I don't like mushrooms. He doesn't like beer. We move on with our lives.
Right. Exactly.
I have to say, I do, as I said before, I do enjoy a cocktail, but I also enjoy feeling good. And I have a ring, a very popular ring that I sleep with, right? And then when I wake up in the morning and I download the data, it'll tell me, wow, you slept so much better this night. And that may have been a night where I didn't have a late night of drinking, or I didn't drink at all, versus I'm out at, a sporting event and I know I've had a few, and then I try to go to sleep and wake up. So even seeing those physical results from a ring can actually help me and help a consumer decide, what, maybe I'll just make the right decisions at the right time when I'm going to consume, and then when I'm going to sort of abstain from that.
Yeah, being sober curious is about weighing the costs and benefits. Ultimately, the costs of this behavior outweighing the benefits, and from that place, making a choice. Is this an appropriate time? Is it worth the payoff tomorrow to have a drink tonight? Is it worth it to me? And then taking it on a case by case basis.
And I think to Lolita's point, in the last 10 years, it had been an abstraction. I think I feel better when I don't drink. Now we have wearables and data, and it sounds like, Lolita, the report you might have pulled down has said you slept well because you did not drink, or you slept poorly because you did. It's no longer a mystery. And if someone is looking for, as we saw in this data, to be healthier, have better mental health, to be more physically capable, to make more money, and they discover that through hard data, being, through their Ring or what have you, their Whoop or their Apple Watch, that becomes the reason. I think it'll be a much easier thing for them to consider what the options are.
Yeah. As we were talking about making those decisions, I think about the spirits industry. And in the beginning, I mentioned the data point of over $1 billion in non-alcoholic beverages in terms of revenue. Although there is a decline, from people that are purchasing alcohol, I do think it is a little bit more of a quality over quantity as much. So I think if we went deeper into the data on what types of spirits are being purchased, and they're wrapped around more celebratory reasons, or, not just a day-to-day going to the liquor store and grabbing something, I think that is another thing we could continue to dig into, as when we are consuming, why are we consuming, and does that change sort of the quality of what that drink is, versus just let me rush to this happy hour that's between 3 and 6, and it's more of a well version of the drink, and I'm drinking 10 of them and I feel crappy. And all those things are really so interesting. I wanted to be mindful of time, and I want each of you to sort of give your closing thoughts. When we think about the consumer and the consumption of alcohol, there's a number of different levers for people to make that decision to drink less. What do we think we'll continue to see in the future, in the next 5 to 7 years, as it relates to that industry and also to consumer choice? Jordan, if you don't mind, I pass the first one off to you.
Sure. Hard to say. I think if you would have asked me that question 5 or 10 years ago, I don't think I would have come up with what we have today. I think even the point you just alluded to, Lolita, with the wearables is really, really interesting angle that's going to maybe, fuel some of this conversation and accelerate some of that. I think it's incumbent on all of these brands, particularly the alcohol brands and beverage brands and other, we haven't really touched on cannabis, obviously in a beverage context, but even outside of that, I think everyone is clamoring for something. I think what we've seen from the emergence of this movement that Ruby's described and how quickly it kind of picked up steam at your open houses or your open mics, whatever you called them, Ruby. I think there's clearly something there. And I think what's interesting to me about all of this, especially the sober curious movement, is that there's nothing new here. What's new is that there's now a new way to talk about this. And my grandmother was in the Temperance League, and that didn't have any impact on me. And yet here we are having this conversation. And I know as a millennial, it's affected a lot of my friends, and they've chosen this path. And so as more and more people are kind of dabbling in this space and thinking about what it could mean for them, now that there's a new language to kind of really explore, I think there are going to be so many more options and things that people are curious about in terms of how they can replace some of the social elements of drinking, or the way you explore an evening and have a great time. You talked about maybe things moving more premiumized. It's more of a splurge and a treat than it was in the past, but it doesn't mean people are less interested in those things. And I think that's going to open up a ton of opportunity for that.
And yeah, I mean, I think one thing for me that came through really strongly in the data that I was so happy to see there, because it just confirmed something that I've witnessed kind of with my eyes time and again, is what I call the ripple effect. I think a lot of respondents, I think the top respondent was that in terms of what was influencing them to drink less, or at least try to drink or try to cut back, or to even think about cutting back, it was friends and family who had got sober curious, or whether they were calling that or not, who had decided that they were going to make a change. And underneath that was, podcasts and influencers and health messaging, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, this ripple effect, I think, is real. What it means is, your best friend decides to drink less, and you notice that they are experiencing great benefits. And so that's really influential to you. And then, so for every person who kind of embarks on this journey and starts talking about it and talking about the benefits of drinking less or being more conscious about their drinking choices, everybody in their circle is going to kind of be influenced by that choice, that personal choice that they're making. Jordan, you sort of mentioned how, in a way, the plant-based movement went from thinking very big picture into these very individual choices. This is a good thing for the planet, and actually it's good for us. This actually has sort of gone the other way. It's almost like, this is something I'm doing for me and it feels really good for me. And yet the ripple effect broadens it out to impact, honestly, all of society. When we think about how many issues, whether it's, people getting DUIs, whether it's people being injured as a result of drinking, whether it's people experiencing very negative health conditions as a result of drinking, more people being sober curious, this ripple effect, in effect, is going to have an impact on the wider society as time goes on.
Absolutely. And I think, going back to the data that we've all been looking at, it's hard to predict where it's going to go, but I think the unlock and the solution is baked into that. I think that's the goal, is to look at the data that we have, and of course that we have in this study from HumanTel, understand where we can go. I think two of the most interesting things at a high level that came out of this for me were the different themes that people were really looking at: physicality versus mental versus professional and work and their finances. I hadn't really considered the various dimensions of that. And the other one that we really didn't get to touch on is how within different ethnic cohorts, as I recall, different themes emerge as being the number one driver. And I would have assumed this was a monolithic thing, both in terms of what was driving this and that it was driving everyone exactly the same way. And within different ethnic groups, it actually turned out through the data that we saw some really interesting nuances of how to better capture the Black versus the white versus the Hispanic versus different generational cohorts in terms of what they were striving for in their lives and why sobriety was interesting to them. Is that going to unlock different product or different lifestyle solutions for them? Very well could. From a communication standpoint, very certainly is going to have an impact in terms of how you talk to those different consumers.
Absolutely. And you really said it. We really just scratched the surface. The data will really help marketers sort of guide them in this space. And there were so many other things that we didn't have a chance to get to today. But when we think about physical, emotional, social, and practical, they're key motivators for most consumers when they're deciding to curb alcohol consumption. We see that many have begun the journey of smart consumption. Many have decided to choose quality over quantity, while others have found substitutes to really achieve their personal goals. And we will continue to lean into the data and pull those nuggets to help us all continue to make smart decisions, not only for our brands, our partners, but also for ourselves. I would like to thank you both, Jordan and Ruby, for your insights today and your contributions to this cerebral cocktail conversation. Yeah, I like that. And I want to thank everyone for listening to the Human Tell podcast. We hope today's conversation gave you something to think about. And until then, stay curious. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.